I'd been doing this for 12 years, and I still got the same feeling every time I stepped off the main road into real wilderness. Not excitement exactly, more like settling into a rhythm I knew by heart. The Shasta Trinity National Forest spread out ahead of us, thick with Douglas fir and pine, the kind of backcountry that made city people remember how small they really were. "This is it," I said, adjusting the straps on my pack. 3 days, 2 nights, and we'll come out the other side with some stories to tell. The 4 of them stood behind me on the trailhead, looking like they'd walked straight out of a gear catalog. Brian had on compression everything, shirt, shorts, even his socks probably, all in matching black and neon green. Todd kept moving around, trying to find a comfortable position under a pack that was clearly too heavy for him. Jen and Sarah had their phones out, already taking pictures of the wooden trail marker. "How many miles today?" Brian asked, bouncing on his toes like he was warming up for a sprint. "About 8 to our first campsite," I said. "Nice and easy to start." 8 miles? Brian laughed. "Dude, I run 10 miles before breakfast. This is going to be a walk in the park." I'd guided enough trips to recognize the type. Brian was the guy who'd signed up to prove something, probably to himself more than anyone else. He'd mentioned CrossFit about 6 times during our pre-trip meeting, along with his deadlift numbers and how many pull-ups he could do. The kind of guy who thought the outdoors was just another gym. Todd pulled his pack higher on his shoulders. 8 miles sounds perfect to me. This thing weighs like 50 pounds. "That's because you packed half of REI, Sarah said, grinning at him. "I told you not to bring the camp chair." "The chair's essential," Todd said. "My back's not 25 anymore." Jen snapped a photo of the group. "This is going to be amazing content." "Sarah, we should do one of those weekend recap posts when we get back to the city." "Definitely. I'm thinking brunch at that place in North Beach. Then maybe the farmer's market." They kept chatting about their plans for San Francisco while I looked at my map one more time. The route was simple. Follow Squaw Creek Trail northeast for about 6 miles, then branch off onto a smaller path that would take us to our first campsite. I'd done this exact trip probably 20 times over the years. Good for beginners. Pretty enough to keep people interested. Close enough to civilization that we wouldn't be completely cut off if something went wrong. "All right, let's move," I said, starting down the trail. The first hour went smoothly. The path was well maintained and mostly flat, winding through stands of pine and the occasional oak. Brian stayed right behind me, making comments about the pace and how we could easily double our speed. Todd brought up the rear, already breathing harder than he should have been. Jen and Sarah walked together in the middle, stopping every few minutes to take pictures of wildflowers or interesting rock formations. "So what's the deal with wildlife out here?" Brian asked. "Bears? Mountain lions?" "Black bears mostly," I said. "They're around, but they tend to avoid people. Just keep your food in the bear canisters and you'll be fine." "What about mountain lions?" "More rare. I've seen maybe 3 in 12 years of doing this." "Bet I could take a mountain lion," Brian said. "I mean, if it came down to it." I looked back at him. "Let's hope it doesn't." By mid-afternoon, we'd covered about 5 miles. The temperature was perfect, warm but not hot, with a breeze coming down from the higher elevations. Todd was starting to lag, and I could see sweat stains spreading across his shirt. Jen and Sarah seemed comfortable enough, though they were taking more frequent water breaks. Brian, on the other hand, looked like he'd barely started walking. "This is way too slow," he said, not for the first time. "We're moving like tourists." "We are tourists," Sarah pointed out. "Speak for yourself. I'm an athlete." I stopped the group near a small clearing where a Squaw Creek ran close to the trail. "Water break. Fill up your bottles if you need to." Todd dropped his pack with a grunt and sat down heavily on a fallen log. "How much further to camp?" "About 3 miles, I said. "We're making good time." "Good time?" Brian shook his head. "I could have been there and back by now." He walked over to the creek and splashed water on his face, then stood up and looked down the trail ahead of us. I could see the wheels turning in his head. "You know what?" he said. "I'm going to scout ahead. Check out the campsite. Maybe find us a good spot to set up." "No," I said immediately. "We stay together. That's rule number 1. Come on, man. I'll jog ahead, scope it out, and come back. It'll take me like an hour, tops." "Brian, I'm serious. We don't split up." He was already bouncing on his toes again, that restless energy that had been building all day. "Look, I appreciate the whole safety first thing, but I'm not some weekend warrior. I know what I'm doing. You know CrossFit. This is different." "How is it different?" "It's just running on dirt instead of a treadmill." I felt my jaw tighten. I'd had this conversation before with overconfident clients, and it never ended well when I gave in. "The trail splits in a couple places up ahead. It's easy to take a wrong turn. Then I'll follow the creek. Water always leads somewhere, right? Brian, listen to me. We stay together." But he was already moving, stepping away from the group and stretching his hamstrings like he was getting ready for a race. "I'll meet you guys at the campsite. Squaw Creek, right? How hard can it be to find?" "Don't do this," I said, but he was already jogging away from us, his neon green shirt flashing between the trees. I watched him disappear around a bend in the trail, his footsteps fading into the normal sounds of the forest. Todd, Jen, and Sarah were all looking at me, waiting to see what I'd do. "Should we go after him?" Jen asked. I thought about it. I could probably catch up to Brian if I really pushed, but that would mean leaving the other 3 behind or forcing them to keep a pace they couldn't handle. And honestly, part of me thought he'd realize his mistake once he got out of sight and come back on his own. "He'll be fine," I said, though I didn't entirely believe it. "He's probably already regretting the decision." We finished our water break and continued up the trail. I kept expecting to see Brian coming back toward us, maybe sheepish and ready to admit he'd gotten turned around. But the miles passed, and there was no sign of him. By the time we reached the campsite near Squaw Creek, the afternoon was turning into evening. The spot was exactly where it should be, a flat area about 50 yards from the water, with a fire ring and a bear box for food storage. It was peaceful and pretty, the kind of place that would normally make me feel satisfied with a day's work. But Brian wasn't there. I put down my pack and looked around the campsite, checking for any sign that he'd been through. No footprints in the soft dirt, no disturbed plants, nothing to show he'd ever made it this far. "Where is he?" Sarah asked, voicing what we were all thinking. "He probably took a wrong turn," I said. "He'll figure it out." But even as I said it, I was doing the math in my head. Brian had left us around 2 o'clock. It was now close to 6. Even if he'd gotten lost, he should have been able to backtrack to the main trail and find his way here. The guy was arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. I helped Todd, Jen, and Sarah set up their tents while keeping one eye on the trail, listening for the sound of footsteps or voices. The creek made noise nearby, and somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker was working on a dead tree. Normal forest sounds, nothing out of place. As the sun started to drop behind the trees, the temperature began to fall. I pulled on a fleece jacket and got a fire going in the ring. Todd sat close to the flames, still looking tired from the hike. Jen and Sarah had their phones out, but there was no signal this far into the wilderness. "Maybe he found a different campsite," Todd suggested. "There could be other spots along the creek." "Maybe," I said, though I knew this was the only established site in the area. There were places you could camp if you really knew what you were doing, but Brian didn't strike me as the type to improvise. The sky turned purple, then black. I handed out headlamps and made dinner on my camp stove. Dehydrated pasta that tasted better than it had any right to after a long day of hiking. Todd, Jen, and Sarah ate quietly, stealing quick looks at the dark forest around us. "He's going to be cold out there," Jen said. "He didn't have a sleeping bag or anything." "He's got his gear," I said. "I saw him pack it this morning." That was true, but it didn't make me feel any better. Brian had been wearing shorts and a compression shirt when he'd taken off. Even with the gear in his pack, he'd be uncomfortable once the temperature really dropped. I stayed awake long after the others had gone to their tents, feeding small pieces of wood to the fire and listening to the night sounds. Owls called back and forth across the valley. Something, probably a deer, moved through the brush on the other side of the creek. Standard wilderness night. Nothing unusual. But I kept thinking about conversations I'd had with other guides over the years. Stories about hikers going missing in this general area, usually inexperienced people who'd wandered off marked trails. The Forest Service hadn't issued any official warnings, and most of the time these things turned out to be nothing more than poor planning and bad decisions. Still, there had been a pattern. 3 or 4 incidents over the past couple of years, all in roughly the same section of the Shasta Trinity. People would go missing for a day or two, then turn up acting strange, like they couldn't quite remember what had happened to them. I shook my head and added another piece of wood to the fire. Campfire stories, that's all they were. Every wilderness area had its share of local legends and unexplained incidents. Part of the appeal, really, the sense that there were still places where anything could happen. But as the fire burned down to coals and the forest grew quieter around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone wrong. Brian was arrogant and reckless, but he wasn't the type to just disappear without a trace. I banked the fire and crawled into my tent, but sleep didn't come easily. Every sound outside, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of wind in the branches, made me think of Brian stumbling through the dark, lost and getting more confused by the hour. I grabbed my headlamp and checked the time on my watch. Almost 11. The others had been asleep for hours, but I couldn't shake the image of Brian stumbling around out there in the cold. The temperature had dropped into the 40s, and even with his gear, he'd be miserable. The beam of my headlamp cut through the darkness as I made my way back to the main trail. Every step felt too loud in the quiet forest, my boots crunching on pine needles and small rocks. I kept the light pointed down to avoid ruining my night vision, but it made the world feel small and tight, just a few feet of lit ground surrounded by black nothing. I'd gone maybe half a mile when I started calling his name. Not too loud. Sound traveled far in the wilderness at night, and I didn't want to wake every animal within a square mile. Just enough to let him know someone was coming if he was within hearing distance. "Brian? You out here?" The forest swallowed my voice. I stopped every few minutes to listen, hoping to hear a response or the sound of footsteps. But there was nothing except the usual night sounds. An owl somewhere up the slope. The distant murmur of water over rocks. I was starting to think I'd have to expand my search pattern when my headlamp picked up a figure sitting on a fallen log about 20 feet ahead. My pulse jumped before I recognized the neon green of Brian's shirt. "There you are," I said, relief flooding through me. Man, I was starting to get worried. Brian looked up as I came over, completely calm, not shivering, not looking lost or confused, just sitting there like he was waiting for a bus. But as I got closer, I could see his clothes were torn in several places, dirt smeared across his shirt and arms. His shorts had a long rip down one leg. "What happened to you?" I asked, playing my light over him. "You look like you wrestled a bear." Got lost, he said simply. Found some old deer trails back that way. He gestured vaguely toward the trees. Thought I could cut through to the creek, but it just kept going deeper into the woods. That's when I saw the blood. A dark stain spreading down his left leg, starting just above the knee. I crouched down and pointed my headlamp at the wound. It was deep, maybe 4 inches long, with rough edges that were still bleeding. Jesus, Brian, this needs attention. It's fine, he said. But I was already pulling my first aid kit from my pack. No, it's not fine. This is a serious cut. I pulled out antiseptic wipes and gauze. How did this happen? Must have fallen on some rocks. I don't really remember. I started cleaning around the wound, trying to get a better look at it. The edges were too jagged for a clean fall, too precise for random contact with stone. They looked more like... I pushed the thought away and focused on stopping the bleeding. Hold still, I said, pressing gauze against the gash. Brian pulled his leg away from me. I said it's fine. You're bleeding through your shorts. This needs to be bandaged properly. It doesn't hurt. I looked at him in the weak light of my headlamp. That wasn't normal. A cut this deep should have been hurting, especially after sitting in the cold for hours. But Brian's face was blank, almost peaceful. Look, we can argue about it back at camp, I said. Can you walk? He stood up without any effort. No wince or favoring of the injured leg. I watched him take a few steps, expecting to see some sign of discomfort, but he moved normally. More than normally, actually. There was a strange smoothness to his movement that hadn't been there before. We made our way back to camp in relative silence. I kept my headlamp pointed ahead, checking the trail for obstacles, but I found myself looking at Brian every few steps. Something about the way he moved through the darkness bothered me. He seemed too comfortable, too sure of his footing on unfamiliar ground. When we reached the campsite, the embers of our fire gave off a faint orange glow over the tents. Everything was quiet. Todd snoring from one tent, the soft sound of breathing from the women's shelter. You should eat something, I said quietly, gesturing toward the pot of leftover pasta I'd left covered near the fire ring. And we need to take another look at that leg. I'm not hungry, Brian said. He walked past me toward his tent without another word. Brian, I kept my voice low. Are you sure you're okay? You seem different. He stopped at the entrance to his tent and looked back at me. In the dim light, his face was hard to read, but there was something in his eyes that made me take a step back. Not anger exactly, but an intensity that hadn't been there before. I'm fine, he said again, and disappeared into his tent. I heard the zipper close, then nothing. No rustling of sleeping bag, no sounds of someone settling in for the night. Just silence. I banked the fire and sat back down on the log I'd been using earlier. My headlamp turned off, but still hanging around my neck. The camp felt different now, though I couldn't put my finger on why. Brian was back, safe, and that should have been the end of it. But the wound on his leg kept bothering me. Those edges, the way they curved slightly, almost like... I shook my head. I was letting my imagination run wild. People got hurt in the wilderness all the time, usually in ways that didn't make immediate sense. Adrenaline could mask pain, and shock could make someone act strangely for hours after an injury. But as I sat there in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the forest, I found myself thinking about conversations I'd had over the years with other guides. Specifically, an old-timer named Pete, who'd been working these mountains for 30 years before he retired. Pete had a collection of stories that most of us dismissed as the rambling of someone who'd spent too much time alone in the woods. Stories about hikers who went missing for a day or two, then turned up acting like completely different people. People who claimed not to remember what had happened to them, who seemed uncomfortable around their own friends and families. Pete always insisted there was something wrong with certain parts of the Shasta Trinity, places where the normal rules didn't apply. I'd always figured Pete had read too many horror novels and spent too many nights by campfires listening to urban legends. But sitting here now, thinking about the look in Brian's eyes and the strange, calm way he'd reacted to a wound that should have had him in agony, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe Pete's stories weren't as crazy as they'd sounded. The temperature continued to drop. I pulled my jacket tighter and added a small piece of wood to the coals, just enough to keep them alive without creating a real flame. From Brian's tent, there was still no sound at all, not even breathing. I told myself he was probably just exhausted, maybe in mild shock from his ordeal. People dealt with trauma in different ways, and Brian's particular brand of machismo probably wouldn't allow him to admit he'd been scared or hurt. By morning, he'd probably be back to his normal, arrogant self, complaining about the pace and bragging about his fitness level. But I stayed awake anyway, watching his tent and listening for any sign of movement. The hours passed slowly, marked by the gradual rotation of stars overhead and the changing sounds of the forest as different nocturnal animals became active. Every so often, I thought I heard something from Brian's tent, a soft rustling, or maybe just the fabric moving in the breeze. But whenever I focused on it, trying to determine if it was actually coming from inside the shelter, the sound would stop. By the time the eastern sky started to show the faintest hint of gray, I was exhausted, but still wide awake. My neck ached from constantly turning to check Brian's tent, and my eyes burned from staring into the darkness for hours. But I'd heard nothing unusual, seen no movement, detected no sign that anything was wrong. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe tomorrow we'd all laugh about Brian's adventure and the scare he'd given us. I finally dozed fitfully as dawn approached, my head resting against my pack, one ear still tuned to the sounds of the camp around me. The zipper on my sleeping bag caught as I tried to work my way out of it, the metal teeth sticking in the cold morning air. My back hurt from the restless night, and my neck had a crick from constantly checking toward Brian's tent. I pulled on my boots and crawled out into the quiet camp. Todd's snoring still carried from his tent, a steady rhythm that had been my only real companion during the long hours of watching and waiting. Jen and Sarah's shelter was silent, and from Brian's tent came no sound at all. I walked over to the dead coals of our fire and started rebuilding it, my movements automatic after years of morning routines in the wilderness. The kindling caught quickly, and soon I had a decent flame going. The coffee ritual came next, filling my pot with creek water, measuring out grounds, setting everything on the camp grill. The tent zippers started opening around the same time the coffee began to brew. Todd came out first, his hair sticking up at odd angles, followed by Jen and Sarah. They moved quietly, probably not wanting to wake Brian, but their whispered conversations and the clink of gear being organized filled the morning air. Then Brian's zipper opened. He crawled out of his tent with none of his usual energy or bravado. No stretching, no comments about the sunrise or how well he'd slept. He just stood there next to his shelter, completely still, looking around the campsite like he was seeing it for the first time. His skin had a grayish color that made him look sick, though he showed no other signs of illness. The torn clothes from yesterday hung loose on his body, and I could see the bandage I'd wrapped around his leg was still in place, no fresh blood seeping through. "Morning, Brian," I said, stirring oatmeal in a pot over the fire. "How's the leg feeling?" He turned his head toward me with a strange, deliberate movement, like he had to consciously decide to look in my direction. "Fine," he said, Coffee's almost ready. You hungry? No. I ladled oatmeal into bowls and passed them around to Todd, Jen, and Sarah. They sat on logs around the fire, blowing on their breakfast and making quiet conversation about how they'd slept and what the day might bring. Normal morning camping talk. Brian stayed standing near his tent, watching them eat, not casually glancing over or joining the conversation, actually watching, with a focus that made my skin crawl. His eyes moved from one person to the next, studying their faces and movements like he was memorizing details. Dude, you sure you don't want some of this? Todd asked, holding up his bowl. Dave makes surprisingly good camp food. Brian didn't respond. Didn't even acknowledge that Todd had spoken to him. Todd tried again. Come on, man. Yesterday was rough, but we're all good now, right? Today's a new day. He grinned and made an exaggerated, cheerful face. New day, new adventures, new opportunities to complain about my pack weight. Still nothing from Brian. He kept staring at the group with that same intense focus, his head tilted slightly like he was listening for something beyond their voices. Brian? Sarah said gently. How does your leg feel this morning? Is it hurting? For the first time, he seemed to really hear someone speaking to him. He looked down at the bandaged wound and touched it through the fabric of his torn shorts. It doesn't hurt, he said. That worried me more than if he'd complained about pain. Deep cuts like that got worse overnight, not better. The tissue swelled, the wound edges pulled tight, and every movement became uncomfortable. But Brian showed no sign of discomfort when he walked or bent his knee. I finished my own breakfast and started cleaning up the cooking gear, keeping one eye on Brian the whole time. He'd moved closer to the fire now, but instead of sitting with the others, he stood at the edge of the circle. Every few seconds, he'd turn his head sharply to the left or right, like he was tracking sounds the rest of us couldn't hear. What are you listening for? I asked. He looked at me with those same intense eyes. Nothing. But he kept doing it. Quick, alert movements of his head, always toward the forest around us, like an animal checking for predators or prey. I made my decision right then. Something was wrong with Brian. Maybe a concussion from whatever had happened to him yesterday. Maybe shock. Maybe something else I couldn't figure out. But I wasn't going to take any chances with the safety of the group. Change of plans, I announced, starting to pack my gear. We're heading back to the trailhead today. Todd looked up from his oatmeal. Really? I thought we were doing 2 more nights. Weather's supposed to turn bad, I lied. Better to get out while we can. Jen and Sarah exchanged a look that told me they were relieved. Yesterday's scare with Brian had shaken them more than they wanted to admit, and the prospect of cutting the trip short probably felt like a gift. That's fine with me, Sarah said. I mean, this has been great, but no worries, I said. Sometimes that's how it goes in the wilderness. Better safe than sorry. I waited for Brian to react to the news, protest the change, argue that he was fine, something. But he just stood there, that blank expression on his face, head still turning occasionally toward the trees. The packing went quickly. Everyone seemed motivated to get moving, and within an hour, we had all the gear stowed and the campsite cleaned up. I scattered the fire ashes and made sure nothing was left behind, following the leave no trace principles I'd drilled into clients for years. All right, I said, shouldering my pack. Same formation as yesterday. I'll lead. Everyone else stays together, and we take our time. We started down the trail that would eventually connect back to the main Squaw Creek path. The morning was crisp and clear, perfect hiking weather, but the atmosphere in our group felt heavy. Todd tried making conversation a few times, pointing out birds or interesting rock formations, but his jokes fell flat without Brian's usual responses to play off. Brian walked at the back of the group, maybe 10 feet behind Sarah. I kept checking over my shoulder every few minutes, supposedly to make sure everyone was keeping up, but really to keep an eye on him. What I saw made my stomach tighten. He moved differently than he had 2 days ago. Yesterday, before he'd taken off on his own, Brian had hiked with the aggressive confidence of someone trying to prove his physical superiority. Quick steps, lots of energy, constantly pushing the pace. Now he moved with a different kind of purpose. Smooth, quiet, efficient. Like he was hunting something instead of just walking. His eyes looked around the forest constantly, and every so often he'd pause for a few seconds, head tilted, before continuing. I found myself walking faster than necessary, putting more distance between myself and the rest of the group so I could turn around and watch Brian without being obvious about it. What I saw confirmed my growing worry. He wasn't hiking with us. He was following us. The distinction was subtle but clear. Brian's attention wasn't on the trail ahead or the scenery around us. It was focused entirely on Todd, Jen, and Sarah. He watched the way they moved, noticed when they stumbled or slowed down, tracked their conversations and interactions. When Sarah stopped to retie her boot, Brian stopped too, standing perfectly still about 15 feet behind her. When she finished and rejoined the group, he started walking again. But for those 30 seconds while she was crouched down and vulnerable, he'd watched her with the kind of focused attention that made every instinct I had start screaming warnings. I picked up the pace, eager to get us back to the main trail and then to the parking area as quickly as possible. Whatever was wrong with Brian, I wanted to deal with it somewhere with cell service and easy access to help if we needed it. Behind me, I could hear the normal sounds of the group hiking. Footsteps on packed earth, the occasional comment about the trail or the weather, the rustle of gear and clothing. And underneath it all, barely audible, the sound of Brian following along. Not hiking, following. I was still watching Brian out of the corner of my eye when he suddenly broke into a sprint, passing Sarah so quickly she stumbled sideways into Jen. Before I could call out, he was around the bend ahead of us, his footsteps pounding down the trail until they faded completely. "What the hell?" Todd said, stopping in place. I held up my hand to keep the group where they were. "Stay here. Don't move from this spot." "Should we come with you?" Sarah asked, but I was already dropping my pack and heading after Brian. "No. Wait here. I'll be back in a few minutes." I jogged around the bend, following the trail as it curved left toward a section I remembered passing on our way in. The path here ran along the edge of a steep slope, with rocky outcroppings sticking out over small ravines that cut down toward the creek below. I found Brian standing on one of those outcroppings, maybe 30 feet from the trail. He wasn't moving, just staring down into the ravine below. His back was to me, but I could see his shoulders shaking slightly. "Brian," I called, approaching slowly. "You okay?" He didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge that I'd spoken. I got within 10 feet of him and stopped, following his line of sight down into the darkness below. At first, I couldn't make out what he was looking at. The ravine was maybe 20 feet deep, filled with fallen logs and thick brush that blocked most of the view. I pulled out my flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the ravine floor. The light hit something that made my stomach drop. Spread across the bottom of the ravine were pieces of animals, not whole carcasses, but parts. A deer's hindquarters here, what looked like a rabbit's torso there. Strips of fur and flesh draped over rocks and fallen branches. The remains were arranged in rough piles, like someone had been collecting them. The smell hit me a second later. Sweet decay mixed with the metallic scent of blood, strong enough to make me step back from the edge. I played my flashlight across more of the ravine, picking out additional details that made the scene worse. bones picked clean and cracked open. A section of spotted fur that could only have come from a mountain lion. Long gouges in the dirt where something had been dragged. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. That's when Brian started crying, not sobbing or making noise, just tears running down his face while he continued staring into the ravine. His whole body trembled, but he kept his position at the very edge of the outcrop, like he couldn't look away from what lay below. "I don't understand what's happening to me," he said quietly. I moved closer, keeping my voice calm. "What do you mean?" "I keep thinking about it, about doing things like that." He gestured toward the carnage below, without looking away from it. "I don't want to, but the thoughts won't stop." Every warning Pete had ever given me about these mountains came flooding back. Stories about hikers who disappeared for a day or two, then returned, changed. People who acted different, who seemed to lose pieces of themselves in the forest. Pete had called it an infection, something that got into people and twisted them from the inside. I'd always figured Pete was just telling campfire stories, the kind of legends that grew up around any wilderness area with a few unexplained disappearances. But standing here, looking at the systematic destruction in the ravine below, and listening to Brian describe thoughts he couldn't control, Pete's warnings didn't seem crazy anymore. I reached out and grabbed Brian's arm, meaning to pull him back from the edge. His skin was burning. Not warm from working hard or fever, but actually burning hot, like he'd been lying in direct sunlight for hours. The heat came through his torn shirt, and when I pressed my palm against his forehead, it felt like touching the surface of a camp stove. "Brian, you're sick. We need to get you to a hospital." He turned to look at me then, and what I saw in his eyes made me take a step back. The same intense focus I'd noticed this morning, but stronger. Like he was looking through me instead of at me, seeing something I couldn't see. "Help me," he whispered. "Please, I don't want to hurt them." The way he said "them" made my blood run cold. Not anyone or people. Them. Todd, Jen, and Sarah waiting for us back on the trail. I kept my voice steady, the same tone I used with panicked clients who'd taken a bad fall or gotten lost. "Okay, we're going to help you, but we need to get away from here first." Brian nodded, but he didn't move. He kept looking back and forth between me and the ravine, like he was trying to make a decision. His hands opened and closed at his sides, and I noticed his fingernails looked longer than they had yesterday. Sharper. "Come on," I said, grabbing his shoulder and guiding him away from the edge. "Let's go back to the others." He let me take him toward the trail, but every few steps he'd look back over his shoulder at the ravine. When we reached the main path, I could see Todd, Jen, and Sarah waiting exactly where I'd left them, their faces worried and confused. Brian saw them too, and his whole body went stiff. He stared at the three of them with the same focus I'd seen him watching the animal remains, and for a moment I thought he might run again. Instead, he whispered, "I'm so hungry." I looked at his face, at the fever burning in his eyes and the way his lips had pulled back slightly from his teeth, and I knew we were in serious trouble. Whatever had happened to Brian during his night alone in the forest, whatever had torn apart those animals and left them in piles, it was still happening. And now it was walking back toward my clients with their backs turned, completely unaware of the danger. We needed to get out of these mountains, now. I grabbed Brian's arm and pulled him away from where Todd, Jen, and Sarah were waiting. His skin still burned with that unnatural heat, and I could feel him trembling under my grip. "We're going back to the others," I said, keeping my voice low. "And then we're getting out of here. Fast." Brian nodded, but his eyes kept looking toward where the group stood on the trail. That hungry look crossed his face again, and I held his arm tighter. When we got back to them, Todd immediately started asking questions. "What was that about? Why did you take off like that?" "Thought I heard something," I said, shouldering my pack. "We need to move. Now." "What kind of something?" Jen asked, concern creeping into her voice. I didn't answer directly. Instead, I started walking, setting a pace that was just short of a forced march. There's been some aggressive wildlife activity in this area. The sooner we get back to the main trail, the better. Sarah fell into step beside me. "What kind of wildlife?" "Mountain lions," I said. It wasn't entirely a lie. They've been tracking through here recently. Behind us, I could hear Brian's footsteps. Not the smooth stalking movement from earlier, but something irregular. Stumbling steps mixed with longer strides, like he was having trouble coordinating his legs. Then came the sounds. Low moaning noises, barely audible over the normal trail sounds. At first, I thought he might be in pain from his leg wound, but when I looked back, his face showed no sign of discomfort. Just that same blank expression, mouth slightly open, making those soft groaning sounds. Todd heard it too. "Dude, you okay back there?" Brian didn't respond. The moaning continued, a constant low-level noise that made my skin crawl. "Brian," Sarah called over her shoulder. Still nothing. Just those sounds and the irregular footsteps following behind us. I picked up the pace again, pushing the group harder than I normally would. The main trail was still 3 miles away, and every instinct I had was screaming that we needed to cover that distance as quickly as possible. The afternoon heat made the hiking tough, but nobody complained. Even Todd, who usually needed frequent water breaks, kept pushing forward without asking to stop. Maybe they sensed the urgency I was trying to hide, or maybe Brian's strange behavior was making everyone uncomfortable enough to want this hike over with. An hour into our forced march, I noticed Brian's condition getting worse. The moaning sounds had gotten louder, and when I turned to check on him, I saw that his skin had taken on a grayish tint. Not the healthy tan he'd shown off at the beginning of the trip, but an ashen color that made him look sick. Saliva dripped from the corner of his mouth. Not just sweating from the exertion, but actual drooling, like he'd lost control of the muscles in his face. "Dave," Jen said quietly, matching my pace so she could talk without the others hearing. "Something's really wrong with him." I looked back again. Brian was maybe 20 feet behind us now, his breathing hard and raspy. His head hung forward, and every few steps he'd trip slightly before catching himself. "I know," I said. "We're almost to the main trail. We'll figure it out when we get there." But I knew we wouldn't make it that far. Whatever was happening to Brian was getting worse fast, and the 3 people walking ahead of me had no idea how much danger they were in. Another 30 minutes went by before I finally had to call for a water break. Todd was starting to slow down even though he was trying hard to keep up, and Jen and Sarah were both breathing hard from the pace I'd been setting. 5 minutes, I announced, dropping my pack near a fallen log. "Drink some water and we'll keep moving." Todd collapsed onto the log immediately, pulling out his water bottle and downing half of it in long gulps. Jen and Sarah sat beside him, grateful for the rest. Brian didn't stop when the rest of us did. He kept walking, went right by our impromptu rest area, and would have continued down the trail if I hadn't called his name. "Brian, water break." He turned around slowly like he was moving through thick liquid. His eyes had a glassy look that reminded me of someone running a high fever, but his skin still gave off that burning heat I'd felt earlier. He walked back toward us, but instead of sitting down or getting out his water bottle, he just stood there, swaying slightly, that gray color more pronounced now, drool running down his chin. Then he collapsed. not a gradual sinking down or a stumble. 1 second he was standing, the next he was on the ground, his whole body convulsing. His back arched, his arms and legs jerked in violent spasms, and foam mixed with blood started coming from his mouth. "Jesus!" Todd jumped up from the log. "What's wrong with him?" "Stay back," I said, moving toward Brian but keeping the others behind me. "Don't get close to him." The convulsions lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like longer. Brian's body twisted and thrashed against the packed dirt of the trail, his fingernails clawing at the ground and leaving deep scratches in the earth. When the seizure stopped, he lay still for a moment. Then his eyes opened and focused on me with perfect clarity. "Something's wrong inside my head," he whispered, his voice hoarse and strained. "I can't stop thinking about it." I knelt down beside him, close enough to hear but ready to move if necessary. Thinking about what? Hurting them. His eyes flicked toward Todd, Jen, and Sarah. I want to hurt them so bad and I don't know why. The thoughts won't stop. Behind me, I heard Sarah gasp. Brian's hands grabbed the front of my shirt, pulling me closer. His grip was stronger than it should have been, considering he'd just been shaking on the ground. "You have to help me," he said. "I can't control it much longer." I looked down at his hands gripping my shirt and felt my blood go cold. His fingernails had grown longer since yesterday. Not just a little longer, but noticeably different. Sharper, with curved edges that looked more like claws than human nails. When he spoke again, I could see his teeth. They looked wrong too. The canines seemed more prominent, and there were gaps between them that hadn't been there before. "Please," he whispered. "I don't want to hurt them, but I'm going to. I can feel it." I tried to pull back, but his grip tightened. The heat from his skin was getting more intense, and I could see veins standing out in his neck, pulsing with each rapid heartbeat. "Brian, let go of me." Instead, he started trying to sit up. His movements were jerky and uncoordinated, but there was a terrible strength behind them. He was fighting to get to his feet, still holding onto my shirt. "I have to," he said, his voice getting louder. "I have to." I looked over my shoulder and saw that Sarah had moved closer, trying to see what was happening. She was maybe 10 feet away, completely unaware that Brian's fevered look had locked onto her. Brian saw her too. His grip on my shirt loosened as he turned his attention toward her, and I saw his whole body tense, like he was getting ready to jump. And now it was looking at Sarah like she was next. Brian started to push himself up from the ground, his movements becoming more coordinated as his focus moved entirely to Sarah. His breathing had changed too, becoming deeper and more controlled, like he was preparing for something. I reached for the hunting knife on my belt. I'd carried that knife on every wilderness trip for 12 years, mainly for cutting rope or preparing food around camp. I'd never imagined using it for anything like this. But as Brian got one knee under himself and started to rise, still staring at Sarah with those fever-bright eyes, I knew I didn't have a choice. He made it halfway to his feet before I drove the blade into his throat. The knife went in just below his left ear, cutting through flesh and cartilage with surprising ease. Blood sprayed across the trail in a wide arc, and Brian's eyes went wide with shock. He tried to say something, but only managed a wet, gurgling sound before collapsing back to the ground. His hands went to his throat, trying to stop the bleeding, but there was too much damage. Blood poured between his fingers and soaked into the dirt beneath him. It was over in less than 30 seconds. Behind me, someone was screaming. I think it was Jen, but the sound seemed to come from very far away. Todd was shouting my name, asking what the hell I'd done, demanding to know why I'd killed Brian. I stayed kneeling beside Brian's body, watching the blood spread across the trail and feeling like I might throw up. My hands were shaking, and I could smell the metallic scent of blood mixed with that strange, sweet odor I'd noticed in the ravine. "He was infected," I said, not turning around to face them. "Rabies. He was going to attack you." The screaming stopped. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Finally, Todd spoke up, his voice shaky and uncertain. "Rabies? Are you sure?" I stood up slowly, wiping the knife blade on my pants before putting it back in its sheath. When I turned around, all three of them were looking at me with expressions of shock and horror. "I'm sure," I said. "You saw how he was acting. The aggression, the fever, the convulsions. Classic symptoms. He was dangerous." It was a lie, but it was a lie they could understand. A lie that made sense in their normal world, where people didn't turn into predators and arrange animal parts in systematic piles. Sarah was crying now, her hands pressed to her mouth. Jen had her arm around her, and Todd just stood there looking back and forth between me and Brian's body. "We need to get out of here," I said. "Now." I turned away from Brian's body and looked at the three faces staring back at me. Sarah's tears had stopped, but her hands still pressed against her mouth like she was trying to hold back screams. Todd's face had gone completely white, and Jen stood frozen, her arm around Sarah's shoulders. "We're leaving," I said, shouldering my pack. "Right now." "But what about—" Todd started, glancing back at Brian's body. "We leave him. The Rangers will handle it when we report the accident." "Accident?" Jen's voice cracked. "You just stabbed him in the throat." I met her eyes directly. "Brian fell down a ravine while he was sick with rabies. That's what happened. That's what we're going to tell everyone." "But that's not—" "That's exactly what happened," I said, cutting her off. "Brian got infected by a rabid animal during his night alone in the woods. He became aggressive and dangerous. When he fell down that ravine, I stayed behind to search for him, while you three continued to the parking area. When I couldn't find him, I followed your trail out." Sarah lowered her hands from her mouth. "You want us to lie? I want you to tell a story that people will believe. A story that won't get you locked up in a psychiatric ward for the rest of your lives." Todd was still staring at the blood soaking into the trail dirt. "Jesus Christ, Dave, you killed him." "I saved your lives." I adjusted my pack straps and started walking. "Now let's go." The next several hours blurred together into a nightmare of forced marching through terrain that suddenly felt hostile and unfamiliar. Every shadow between the trees looked like it might hide something waiting to attack. Every rustling sound made me reach for my knife before I remembered I'd already used it. Behind me, Todd, Jen, and Sarah walked in stunned silence. Occasionally, one of them would ask a question about what had really happened to Brian, but I shut down every conversation with the same response: rabies, aggression, tragic accident. Eventually, they stopped asking. We made it to the main Squaw Creek Trail as the last daylight went away. I pulled out my headlamp and set a pace that pushed the limits of safe night hiking. The others followed without complaint, maybe sensing that speed was more important than comfort at this point. None of us slept that night. We reached the parking area before dawn, exhausted and stumbling. My truck sat exactly where I'd left it 3 days ago, covered in a thin layer of dust that made the whole trip feel like it had happened weeks ago instead of days. I drove them straight to the ranger station outside Redding, all of us crammed into the truck's cab, and nobody speaking. The sun was just coming up when I pulled into the parking lot beside the small building with its official Forest Service signs and emergency contact numbers. Inside, a young ranger named Martinez took our report while an older ranger named Thompson listened from behind another desk. I did most of the talking, sticking to the story I'd gone over during the drive. Brian had seemed sick on the second day. Aggressive behavior, possible rabies exposure. He'd wandered off the trail and fallen down a steep ravine. I'd searched for him as long as I could before following the others out. Martinez took notes and asked standard questions about timing and location. Todd, Jen, and Sarah sat quietly, nodding when appropriate and adding small details that supported the story. They'd learned the script during the long hike out. "We'll organize a search and recovery team," Thompson said, standing up from his desk. "Can you guide us back to the area where he fell?" I felt my stomach tighten. "Of course, whatever you need. We'll head out this afternoon. Give us a few hours to get personnel together." I nodded and started moving toward the door, hoping to get the others out before anyone thought to ask more detailed questions. "Mr. Hayes?" Martinez called after me. "We'll need you to stay available for follow-up questions. This kind of incident requires a full report." "Absolutely. I'll be at my cabin in Weaverville. You have my number." Outside in the parking lot, I pulled Todd, Jen, and Sarah aside while they waited for Todd's girlfriend to pick them up. "Remember the story?" I said quietly. "Brian fell down a ravine. I searched for him. That's all that happened." "What if they ask more questions?" Sarah asked. "They won't. This kind of thing happens every year in wilderness areas. People get hurt, fall down slopes, get lost. The rangers have procedures for it." A red Honda pulled into the lot, and Todd waved at the woman behind the wheel. "That's our ride," he said, then turned back to me. "Dave, what really happened out there?" I looked at the three of them. These people I'd been responsible for keeping safe, and realized they were going to carry questions about this trip for the rest of their lives. Questions they'd never be able to answer, honestly. "What happened is that you're alive," I said. "Remember that part." They walked away toward the Honda, leaving me standing alone beside my truck. I waited until they'd driven away before getting back behind the wheel and heading toward Weaverville. The drive to my cabin took an hour through winding mountain roads that normally felt like coming home. Today they felt like a retreat from something I couldn't name. The usual landmarks, the old bridge over Clear Creek, the rusted mailbox that marked the turnoff to my road, looked the same as always, but I kept checking my mirrors like something might be following me. My cabin sat at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by pine trees, and far enough from neighbors that I could go days without seeing another person. I'd bought it 5 years ago with money saved from guiding trips, imagining it as a perfect base camp for my wilderness business. A place to rest between expeditions and plan routes for new clients. I parked in my usual spot and sat behind the wheel for several minutes, engine ticking as it cooled. Through my windshield, the cabin looked exactly the same as when I'd left it 4 days ago. Same weathered wood siding, same green metal roof, same small porch where I'd spent countless evenings planning trips into the mountains I thought I knew. I climbed the porch steps and unlocked the front door, then walked straight through to the back porch that overlooked the valley. My camping chair sat where I'd left it, positioned for the best view of the ridgeline that stretched toward Shasta Trinity National Forest. Sitting down in that chair, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Pete Nakamura's number. Pete had retired from guiding 3 years ago, but he still lived up near Eureka and occasionally called with updates about trail conditions or wildlife activity. I almost dialed his number. Almost called to tell him he'd been right about the stories he used to tell around campfires. About hikers who disappeared for a day or two and came back different. About places in the forest where normal rules didn't apply. But my finger hovered over the call button for a long time before I put the phone away. What was I going to say? That I'd killed a client because he'd been infected with something that turned him into a predator? That I'd found a ravine full of systematically arranged animal parts? that Brian's fingernails had grown into claws and his teeth had changed. Even Pete, who'd spent 40 years in these mountains and claimed to have seen things that couldn't be explained, might think I'd lost my mind. The afternoon stretched on while I sat on my porch, watching shadows move across the valley below. Every few minutes I'd think about calling the ranger station to check on the search team they were organizing. Then I'd remember that they were looking for a body at the bottom of a ravine that didn't exist, searching for evidence of an accident that had never happened. By evening, I'd made two decisions. First, I was done guiding groups into that section of Shasta Trinity. Done completely. I'd find reasons to avoid the Squaw Creek area, recommend different routes to clients, maybe even close my business entirely if I had to. But I was never taking another group of people into those mountains. Second, I was going to quietly reach out to other guides in the area. Not to tell them what had really happened. I wasn't that crazy. But to suggest they avoid certain trail systems. To mention increased wildlife activity or unstable terrain conditions. To pass along the kind of warnings that experienced guides shared with each other when they knew something was wrong but couldn't prove it. The sun was setting behind the ridge when my phone rang. The caller ID showed the ranger station number. "Hayes," I answered. "Mr. Hayes, this is Ranger Thompson. We've completed our initial search of the area you described, but we haven't located your client or any sign of where he might have fallen." I closed my eyes. The terrain is pretty rough out there. Lots of small ravines and dense brush. We're going to expand the search tomorrow, bring in additional personnel. We'd like you to come back and help us narrow down the location. Of course, whatever you need. Meet us at the trailhead at 7 a.m. And Mr. Hayes, bring any additional details you might have remembered about exactly where and when you last saw him. Will do. I hung up and looked at my phone for a long time. Tomorrow I'd have to take a search team back into those mountains and pretend to look for a body that was lying on a trail 3 miles from where I'd told them to search. I'd have to act concerned and helpful while they wasted time and resources on a recovery mission that would never find anything. But the alternative was trying to explain what had actually happened, describing the systematic carnage in that ravine, Brian's physical change, the choice I'd made to drive a knife into his throat before he could attack the others. Nobody would believe that story, and even if they did, it would mean admitting that something was wrong in these mountains, something that infected people and turned them into predators, something that might still be out there, waiting for the next hiker who spent a night alone in the wrong part of the forest. I got up from my chair and walked inside, leaving the porch door open so I could still see the mountains in the distance. In my kitchen, I pulled a beer from the refrigerator and stood at the counter, thinking about all the trips I'd taken into Shasta Trinity over the past 12 years, hundreds of clients, thousands of miles of trails, countless nights spent camping in areas I'd thought were safe and known. How many other people had gone missing in those mountains over the years? How many disappearances had been written off as hiking accidents, or people getting lost and wandering off marked trails? I thought about the stories Pete used to tell, and about how quickly I dismissed them as wilderness legends. Stories about people who vanished for a day or two and returned with memory gaps and strange behavior. About sections of forest where experienced hikers reported feeling watched or followed. About animal remains found arranged in ways that didn't match normal predator behavior. I'd always figured Pete was just getting old, letting his imagination run wild during too many nights alone in the mountains. But now I wondered how many other guides had seen things they couldn't explain and chosen not to talk about them. How many had learned to avoid certain areas without ever saying why. My phone buzzed with a text message. Todd, checking to make sure I was okay and asking if I needed anything. I typed back that I was fine, just tired from the long trip. Then I turned the phone off and went back to the porch with my beer. The mountains looked peaceful in the fading light, just like they had thousands of times before. Rolling ridgelines covered in forest, known peaks that had served as landmarks for every trip I'd ever guided. From here, Shasta Trinity looked exactly the same as it always had, but I knew I'd never see it the same way again. Instead of a playground for outdoor enthusiasts, it had become a place where people could disappear and return as something else. A place where normal rules might not apply, and where the things Pete had warned me about were real enough to drive knives into people's throats. I finished my beer as full darkness settled over the valley. Tomorrow I'd have to go back and help search for Brian's body, knowing we'd never find it. Then I'd come home and start making phone calls to other guides, quietly suggesting they recommend different routes to their clients. I'd never tell anyone what really happened on that trail, never describe the choice I'd made, or the infection that had turned Brian into a predator. But I'd make sure other people stayed away from that part of the forest, even if I had to invent reasons for avoiding it. The wilderness I'd loved for 12 years had taught me its most dangerous lesson. Some places were meant to be left alone, and some stories were too dangerous to ever tell.